Hello and welcome to another Django tutorial. Here we have Django databases. So this is an introductory Django database tutorial, but with a slight twist. Here we're going to be utilizing the shell, or the Django shell. So if you've not utilized that before, I'm going to provide a short introduction to that and how to utilize that and the advantages of utilizing a shell to run database queries. So yes, we're going to be exploring Django queries here, or an introductory to Django queries, using the Python interactive interpreter, or the Python shell, or the Django shell. So the coverage here is that obviously the default database is SQLite, so we're not covering any other databases in this tutorial. So we're going to be utilizing the Django SQLite database. We have an introduction to the Python shell and the Django shell, how to activate it, and a few commands to help you get started utilizing the shell. And then we're going to go through some basic queries and query functions using the shell. To ensure that I'm not wasting your time watching this video, because it is fairly lengthy, this is aimed at beginners or for those who want a little recap on performing some basic queries and an introduction to the Django shell. So here I'm going to cover a quick introduction to SQLite. We'll go through the Python shell, we'll just open it up, and this is the shell. I'll take you through one or two shell commands that can be useful, and then we'll build our first model, a simple model that we can utilize and run some queries on. So we'll access the database from the shell, and then I'll go through how to change, or the concepts of a model manager and how to create a model manager in principle. And then we'll add some data to a table, view all the data in the table, and look at individual pieces of data in the table. So we'll look at how those queries can be created. And then we'll retrieve a single object from a database, like I've just said, using get. And then we have a look at updating the data in the database, deleting data, and using some other filter functions, for example, order by, filter, exclude, for example. And then finally, for those who are completely new to Django, I'm just going to go through how to utilize the GUI interface, the Django admin GUI interface, so that you can interface to the database using a graphical user interface, the Django admin interface. So we'll create a new super user, go into that, register the model, and then we'll be able to access that model in the admin area. So for those who haven't utilized the Python interactive shell, just a very quick introduction. Assuming that you're working on Windows, if you have installed Python and head over to the Start button, just type in the word Python, and there will be a list there of Python items, and select the item that's called Python, in this case 3.8, 32-bit, and that will open up the Python shell. So that's what you're looking at here. So simply put, the Python interactive shell or interpreter is used to execute Python commands. So if we were new to Python and we wanted to write Python somewhere, we could write some things in here and Python would run, in this case, a simple multiplication or addition, sorry. But we could also type in other commands or other Python commands, and it would simply output the command. So we're going to utilize this in Django to access the database and manage our database and practice writing queries. For those who are not familiar, creating a new project, we'll just go ahead and create a new Django project so we can run some queries. For those who are familiar with this, you can skip ahead and go to the next section. So I've created a new folder already for this project on my C drive. So I just open up the folder, paste in the link there, select folder. So now working inside of that folder, go to the terminal, create a new terminal, and I want to install the virtual environment for my project and then install Django in the virtual environment. So py for Python, the switch, M, because I'm going to be utilizing a package, and venv, so the virtual environment, and then the folder I want to install the virtual environment, so just venv again. So that's going to build the virtual environment. Once that's done, we just need to go into the virtual environment. So I use the backslash and then scripts. And then I'm tabbing here to go through the to quickly access the name. So activate, so that's going to activate the new virtual environment. So you can see that I'm inside the virtual environment. So now I need to use pip, the package installer, to install Django. So I'll go ahead and do that. That'll take a couple of seconds. So that's going to download a latest version of Django and have that available, so then I can start to build projects and applications. So now I want to go ahead and create a new Django project. So I use the Django admin, and then I type in start project, and then the name of the project I'm going to be calling queries. And I'm going to use the dot, the other attribute here, so that I create the actual project, Django project, inside of the folder here and not into a new folder. So I do that. You can now see I've got this folder here called queries, which is my main Django project folder. So let's just create a new application inside of our new Django project. So we can now use the manage.py file to access the Django admin. So we're going to have a start app, and we're going to call this app just something simple. I'm going to make this up. This is the hardest part of the tutorial for me. Okay, I'm just going to call this blog. Okay, so we start a new app. You can now see I've got a new app folder here appearing in my project folder. Okay, so now I've got that in place. Let's just go ahead. If we're going to be utilizing databases, we're going to need to go into the settings. So just remove that. And in the settings, in your queries folder, I just need to add or include the fact I've got a new project, or sorry, a new application called blog, so I can access and manage my database. And then just for the final step, before we move on to the tutorials, just go ahead and run the server just to make sure that everything is working okay. So it looks like the development server is running okay. So now we're ready to start the tutorial. If you are familiar with creating Django projects, you probably already realize and notice that there is an SQLite database right here. And typically this SQLite database, a lightweight database, is the Django default database that we utilize when we build a new project. And typically we can use this database for creating prototypes or doing some database testing. And this is obviously all saved on disk. So eventually you might outgrow this database and then migrate this to a production level database. Now, one of the problems I think for beginners is that utilizing this database, there isn't a built-in piece of software where we can actually see what data is inside of this database. And I think it's good to be able to visualize our data, because then we can better prepare it to be outputted to our templates. Now, for example, we create a new view in our blog, for example. We then make a query, get some data, and that then gets passed to the template. The template then loops through that data and then outputs it to the screen. Now, sometimes there's problems and it doesn't output what we want. So there's no way of visualizing what data is actually being collected from the database potentially. So by utilizing what I'm going to show you shortly, the Django shell, we can actually run queries. We can practice queries. We can look to see what's in the database. We can add data to the database. So it's just another tool, a development tool that just allows us to learn a little bit more about our database. And like I said, we can practice queries, practice collecting data from the database, see what data is actually being collected from the database, and that will help us prepare our views and our templates more effectively. So let's stop talking about this Django shell and actually go into the shell. So from the command line, I've created a new command line here. So we can just type in py, and then we can use the manage.py and then type in the word shell. So notice that opens up what I showed you earlier, what looks like the Python shell. So the Python interactive shell. So that's essentially what you're looking at here. But the difference here is that we've opened up a Python shell, but we've kind of wrapped around that shell Django. So what I mean by Django wrapper is that we're opening up this Python shell with Django, and Django's basically wrapping around this shell and is providing a few more different features. So for example, when we've opened this shell, we now have Django settings already imported, so we can actually work with our Django application. And we are working from the root folder of our Django project. So that's important to understand too. So we've opened up this interactive console shell here, but we are actually running this from our root folder of our Django project. So like I said, from here we can access our database, and we're going to be running queries. But before we start, I just wanted to show you a few things that you can do in the shell. And one thing I find handy is being able to clear the shell. So if you go into a command here, you type in some commands, it gets a bit busy. So if you press CLS, that just clears the screen. So I find that really useful function to have. If I can find it, yep. So let's just go over quickly how to do that. So if you have started learning Python as well as Django, it's worth knowing a little bit about the OS module. So the OS module is basically, it provides functions for interacting with the operating system. So it's a Python standard utility module. And like I said, it provides a portable way of using operating system dependent functionality. So what we're going to be utilizing here is basically mapping over that CLS command so that we can clear the shell. Okay, so to do that, simply put, we're going to import OS so we can utilize some of that functionality. And then we're going to set up this variable here. So we're going to utilize os.system. And then from there we need CLS. Okay, so that will then set it up. So to access this, we're going to access this through CLS. So this variable we created essentially is now behind the scenes, and we can access it when we need it. If you do close the terminal, you'll need to run this again. So if I type in CLS, you can see that now it clears the screen. So you're going to become familiar with importing things in. So imagine, I think of this as a memory space. You import things into the memory space and then you utilize them. And that's how we're going to access the Django databases and then run queries, etc. So we can also run an import Django. So we can import that module, and then we can run, for example, Django.version. I've written capitals. And there we go. So that's the version of Django that I'm utilizing, 3.0.8. Okay, so before we move on to build a model and create some queries, I'll just point out the fact that here I'm using Visual Studio Code, the terminal. Of course, you can just run a Windows terminal and do exactly the same thing here. So don't think that it's dependent upon having Visual Studio Code to run these commands, etc. You can do exactly what I've just done if you just open up the command prompt first in Windows. Okay, so let's go in and add a model now. So we've created a project previously, and we've added a new app called blog, and we've added that to the settings file. So now we're ready to start. So inside of blogs, I'm just going to go into models and paste in this new model here. So if you're not familiar with databases, you can see here that I've imported the models and time zone because I'm going to be utilizing the time inside of this model here. So I've created a new what is a table essentially in my database called posts. And I'm just adding title, publish, and content. Those are going to be my fields in my database. And here you can see that I'm using the data types. One of them is going to be referencing the time zone. So I'm going to be utilizing the published date in there. And then this is obviously the title, which is going to be a char field. So just character field with a max length of 250. And the content is going to be a text field. Okay then, so first up in our terminal, or in our shell, sorry, we're going to quickly go over how to display all the data in this table. So to do that, we need to first of all import the table into this space. So we're just going to type in from, and then my application or my app here is called blog. So from blog dot and then the models. So we're going inside the models, and then we're going to import, and the actual table here is called posts, or the model's called posts. So I say posts. Okay, so if you're familiar with Django, you probably know the answer already why that isn't working. If you're not familiar with Django, the answer to why this is not working is because this database table doesn't actually exist at the moment. So when we create a new table or update anything in our table, we need to actually migrate and commit it to our database. So if we now just go over, I'm just going to open up a new terminal, open up a new terminal. So what we're going to need to do is actually commit this table to our database. So we're just going to need to run a py manage.py, and then we're going to first of all make migrations. So that's going to prepare everything. Essentially, I just think of make migrations as a check-in facility. It's going to go through the commands that I've typed in here, up top here. It's going to check to see if it's compatible, if it's going to work, and it's going to prepare it ready then to put into my database. So that's what I think of make migrations in general. So you can see that that's made that migration, so it should work, and I should now be able to put it into the database. Notice that it's created something called initial.py file. So if I go into the migrations here, I've got this new file called 001 initial. So if I go inside of here, you can see what's going to happen. It's basically just detailing the changes that I've made. So noticed here that inside my model, I've only created title, publish, and content, but what's actually being applied in the database is ID, title, publish, content. So by default, Django is going to add an ID or a primary key to our table. So if you don't know what primary keys are, it's worth doing a little bit of reading about primary keys. So that's actually what's going to be put inside of our database. Now I can delete the initial if I wanted to, but it's never recommended to delete the initial py file. So let me just close that. So now that's ready. I can now run a py and then a manage.py and then migrate. So that's actually going to apply this to the database. There we go. So because it's the first time that I've run this, there's actually some other tables that Django builds. So it builds a user table, for example. So we will find that we're going to have to open up a new shell to access this table. But before we do that, I just wanted to show you or make you familiar with the Django documentation. So this is Django admin and manage.py. So you'll find that it does specify different ways to access the Python shell. And there's 3 different ways here, depending on what shell that you want to access utilizing Python. So for example, here back in our project, I can run the Django admin. So let's not forget that Django admin command is essentially running the same thing as when we run manage.py. So we can use Django admin and then just type in shell, and that will open up a new shell for us. So let's get back and now access all the data inside of this table. So now let's go ahead and import our new model. So we're going to type in from, and this is going to be from the blog, and then models. And then we want to import the post table. Okay, apologies, I'm not trying to waste your time here. I just wanted to go through this. So you notice now that it isn't working again. And this time it's because of how we're actually accessing the shell. So here we're actually making that wrapper. Remember when I said that when we use the manage.py shell, it's creating a wrapper around the Python terminal, or the Python shell, sorry. So that's importing all our variables into the shell so we can just start typing. In this case, it doesn't seem to be happening. So if you just consult the manual, if you do want to work this way, you'll need to run the imports, etc., before you can then run the other commands. So let's just exit this. So it was just an excuse also to show how to exit the shell. Type in exit. So from here, let's just type in now manage.py and shell. So we've created a nice little wraparound now. So now we can go ahead and do a from. So from blog dot and then the models. So we're going to import posts. And there we go. So now it's working. So behind the scenes, we've actually imported, make a copy of this in the memory here, say, and we can now access this table. Again, I'll just apologize for showing you all those different elements there. There are just so many different ways of fulfilling the same task. And I realize that some people will do things differently. So it just saves answering some questions, and hopefully it just gives you a little bit more insight how others might perform the same actions. Okay, so let's run our first query. So a query you probably already know, but a query is essentially a command that we send off to the database to collect data or do something within the data base, and then potentially return data or update that data in the database. Now, if you're familiar with SQL or databases in general, what's happening here essentially is Django is preparing. We type in some commands to Django, some queries, and then it basically, behind the scenes, it's going to translate that into the corresponding database language so it can then deal with that command. So if you're familiar with using Django for different databases, you'll find that you actually need to specify in the settings what database to utilize. And essentially what's happening here is that each database, whether you're using SQL or Oracle, etc., they all have sometimes different commands to do the same actions. So we need to tell Django how to translate what we type in here into the corresponding database's language so that it can effectively query, talk to the database that we have connected to our project. So we're using, don't forget, SQLite here. So let's just go ahead now and query this table and return back everything that's inside of this table. So we've got posts, so we're referring to posts here. And we want to select objects, and then we're going to run .all. So this essentially here, if you're familiar with SQL, is running the select all from the table and posts and collect everything and return it. So select from all, select from all. So this is going to return absolutely nothing because there isn't anything inside of our table at the moment. So as you might assume, the next thing that we're going to do is actually add data to this table. Now, apologies, I keep doing this a lot in this tutorial, but if you're familiar with utilizing the Django admin, then you'll know that we can just create a super user, go into the start the server, go into the admin area, and we can create some data. So it's not always going to be the case that you want to do that. So hopefully you can kind of see the value here. We can add some data on the fly, and we can make a script to add data for us. That's probably an advanced type of thing that we might want to do. I did make a tutorial not too long ago about utilizing or creating custom commands. And I did show you how to create some data for the database and automate that. So let's go ahead and just create some data for this table. So let's make a new variable called post. So this is going to hold all the data that we want to put in the database. So we're going to say we're going to use the table posts, and we want to put some data inside of it. So you'll notice that we're using title, publish, and content. Now publish is going to be automatically created, and it's going to be what's going to be inserted into that field is the actual time. So when we create some new data, the time at that specific time will be added to this field. So we don't need to worry about that. So we want to add some data to the title. So title equals, and then new data. I call that new data 1. And then we then want to add an item in the content. So content equals, and then new content 1. Okay, so that ends up like that. So we now have some data that we want to put in the database. So I just press enter. So what's happened now is I've prepared this function, this variable here with this data. So nothing's going to happen to this until I actually save. So I need to actually save this data to the database. So I need to run post, so my variable, and then the command .save. So that's the actual command that's going to commit this data to the database. So go ahead and press enter, and you can see that we don't get any reply, etc., but we don't have any problems. So we can assume that that now is stored in the database. Of course, we can test that. I'll just press up. Notice that we can access the previous commands, and then I run the post objects all again. And you can now see it says post object 1. So for me, this is the best time to introduce to you why we have this piece of code down here, typically underneath each of your models. So what's returning here from a database is an object. And that's all fine. We could utilize that in Django. We could create our view and our template, and everything would be absolutely fine. But typically when we when we're working with data, we want to have some sort of human readable data so that we can see what data we're working with. So we know that this object 1 probably refers to ID 1 in our table. So we want to translate this into something that we can understand. So here we have this dunder_stir method. And essentially what this is going to do is just return like I said, a readable string representation of this object. So what we've done here, return self, and then we're saying title. So by default, the default output is going to be the title name. So I've created some changes to our model here. So in Visual Studio Code in our terminal, I just need to close the shell, and then just go back into the shell. And from here, we can just utilize the previous commands. So post object all. So let's, first of all, we need to actually collect the database. So from blogs model, import posts. And now let's go ahead and do a post object all again. So previously it returned an object. Notice now that it's returning new data 1. And if you remember, we created some new data, and the name or the title of that new post, that new data that we saved to this table, was new data 1. So here we can actually see this dunder_stir method in use. Obviously, it makes it a lot easier to understand what data is actually being returned. Okay, so next up, let's talk a little bit about the object manager. Sorry, the model manager. So here, what we have down here, we've got posts. So when we run this query, we've got posts. So that's obviously the table. Then we've got objects, and then we got all. So the objects is the model manager. So objects is the default Django model manager. And that's basically the interface, to paraphrase from the Django documentation, is an interface through which database query operations are provided to the Django models. So essentially, I like to think of this is where we're going to pass our code, our query code to, and then it will eventually then go on to collect the data from a database and so on. So this can be changed. So there's many reasons why we might want to make our own model manager. We might want to make some initial queries or some default queries, so which runs all the time. So take, for example, this post here. Now, inside of this post table, we're going to have content, blog content, say. Now, something that we haven't put here is, for example, it might be there might be some sort of flag for whether the content should be shown or not. So, for example, active. So we can flag this a post, whether it's active or not. So when we query the database, imagine we've got a page on our blog and it's going to show all of the items inside of here. We only want to show items that are actually active. We don't want to show the ones that aren't active because that's assuming that those posts aren't ready to be displayed. So instead of actually making a filter inside of our view, we can create a model manager that automatically filters that out before it gets to the view. And essentially what we're trying to do is create our views, put as less code in the views as possible, and to put more of the management functionality of our data inside of our models. That's the general principles of what you're trying to achieve. So more functions inside your models and less in the views. So having a model manager that's one example of where you might use a model manager. So you'd create that functionality so that in your view, you pull data again from posts, but it's only going to show the items that are active. So hopefully that makes sense, but it doesn't matter. I just want to show how you can easily create a new model manager. So let's go ahead and create that. So if we just go into our posts and let's just go ahead and type in new manager. That's nice and simple, equals, and then models, extending manager. Okay, so here we've simply just defined a new model manager called new manager. Now, this is how far we're going here. We're just going to use this new manager like we do with objects, but we're going to change the word objects now to new manager. But eventually what you'll have is another function up here potentially where you define what's happening in that new manager. So that from the view, when you run a query on this post table, it will use the new manager function that you add up here, for example, that maybe is making some filters on the table, etc. And it will run that automatically and then return back the data after the model manager has done its job on the data. So now we've done that, I'm just going to close this terminal, so this shell, and then I just need to run a migrate because I've added new items to the model. So make migrations, and then I'll just run a migrate. And now let's just go back into the shell. So we'll run a py migrate and shell. So inside of the shell, let's see if we can utilize that. So we're going to import posts again, and this time we'll run the objects all, and notice that we're receiving an error. And the reason why we're receiving an error is because we've created a new model manager. So what we now need to type in is posts dot and then new manager dot all. And it says new type post has no attribute new manager. I forgot the A, I spelt it incorrectly. There we go. So mangr.all. And there we go. So we received data back, or all the data from our table here, utilizing our new model manager, which I spelled incorrectly. I apologize again for going around in loops, but I do want you to maybe explore this idea of model managers, and I want you to try and, if you don't already understand, you can skip ahead if you do. I just want to explain this one more time, the reason why you want to make a model manager. So like I previously said, here this gives you the power of now creating a new function, for example here. And in this function what you can do is set out commands that deals with the data, that manages the data in a certain way that helps prepare it ready, or pre-prepare the data, so that when you go into your views and create a view and access the data is pre-prepared. So that means less code inside of your view. That's essentially what's happening, and that's what you're trying to aim for: less code in the view and more work done in your models. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Let's move on to the next part. So the next item I want to show you is values. So here what we have in the previous query showing all the data is all it's really showing us is the name or the title of the post. It's not actually showing us all the data. So is there a way of showing all the data in our table? Well, there is, yeah. So what we can do is we can run our post .newManager.all, But now what we can do is just add dot values on the end. And that's going to show all the values inside of our table. So here I can clearly now see all the data that's inside of this table. So as I previously said, and like what we saw, we didn't type in an ID. That just is automatically incrementing. So when I add a new post now, the ID for the next item is going to be number 2. Remember, this is the primary key, so it has to be unique on all the items. We've got a title. The publish, I remember I didn't type anything for that, and you can see that it's put the date time into there. And then the content I did add. So I'm just going to add some more data to my database. So I'll go ahead and create this variable post and add some data. And then don't forget you need to do a post save to actually save it to the database. So now that's saved, so I'll just double check that's in the database. You can now see I've got the second set of values, ID number 2, starting here. So we've covered how to access all the data in our database. So let's just go through a simple way of accessing just one item in the database. So if you're following the blog series, you'll probably see where this might become useful. For example, when you go to an individual blog page, you want to access a very individual piece of data. So let's go ahead and just access one piece of data. So we can set this up by starting with the name of the table we want to get data from. Now we are using New Manager, so if you have come into this tutorial halfway through, this is just a new model manager we've created, so you're probably using objects. And then in this case, we're not using .all, we're going to be utilizing .get. So .get is going to allow us to access one very specific piece of information. So we need to define what data we want to collect. So we can do that by utilizing one of these fields here. So let's use ID. So we're going to say we want to collect the data from a database where the ID is equal to, for example, 1. Now remember, the ID 1 is this piece of data here. So if we run this, you can see it says has no attribute new manager, because again I've typed in manager correctly and I've incorrectly typed it into my model. So let's just change that, and there we go. So I've run the ID equals 1, and you can see it now just returning data inside of our table where item equals ID 1. Okay, so next up is filters. So this is all the data that we have in the database currently. Now there isn't too much data here, so if you imagine this was 1,000, 100,000 items in our database, the filter would make a little bit more sense, but let's just go through the basic principles of a filter. So first of all, we define the table, and then obviously the new manager, spelt incorrectly. And this time we're going to run a filter. So we're going to use the filter function here. So this filter function is going to allow us to specify what we want to filter from our table and return that data. So post.newManager.filter. So let's just return all the items in our database where the ID equals 1. So if we run that, you can see it just returns the first item. So this is the simple premise of a filter. Now we can extend this filter. So for example, if we wanted where ID equals 1 and we wanted something else, so for example where title equaled, and in this case new data 1. So obviously we're just selecting from the first item in our database, so run that, and you can see it still returns our data. So just to show it working, so for example new data 2, so it should have ID 1 and title new data 2. Obviously that isn't going to return any data because it doesn't match any other items in our data set. So if I run that, you can see it returns absolutely nothing. So there's a simple example of how we can first extend the filter by adding more items inside of the filter. So in addition to filtering or extending the filter, we can also add or chain filters. So for example, here we have filter ID 1. Now, if I, for example, was to press enter here, you probably already noticed that you can only type commands on the single line. So if you wanted to kind of just break this up slightly to make it easier by adding different lines for different filters, then we can use the backslash, and you can notice now when I press enter, it doesn't commit the command. I simply go to the next line. So here I can type in an additional filter. So this would be an and, so where the filter ID equals 1 and, for example, title equals new data 1. And there we go. So it produces the result. So this is an and filter. So filter ID equals 1 and filter title equals new data 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a look at the exclude, because this just extends our filter. So we might run a filter, but we want to then exclude items from that filter additionally. So let's go ahead and just show how that might be done. So we're using post new manager, and we're going to use a filter. So we're going to filter this time by publish and then the year. So we're going to access the year, and that's going to be 2020. So let's just run that. So notice that it returns all the items in our table because all of the items in our table was created in the year 2020. So we'll go ahead now and just create an additional filter. So I'm going to use the backslash here to go to the next line to make it easier to see. And now I'm going to use the exclude. So I'm going to exclude where ID equals 1. So obviously the first item in our table equals 1. There's only 2 items. So that should now just return new data 2. So I'm just excluding from this filter here ID equals 1. And notice now it's just returning new data 2. So that's just an example, a simple example of how to use exclude. Okay, so next up is order by. So there'll be a number of times where you want to extract data from the database and have it ordered in a particular way. So sometimes that's ordered by alphabetically, sometimes that's ordered by published date, for example. So that can be managed actually within the model itself here. So that's just another item which can be managed within models, and it doesn't need to be programmed in views. But let's just use it here so we can understand what's going on. So here we've got post new manager filter. So we've got our filter and we're using a new line here, and we're running the order by function. And we're going to order by publish. So this is the published date. So as you might imagine, that's going to return new data 1 and then the second post new data 2, because new data 1 was obviously created first. It's ordered in that way. So if we want to order it the opposite way, then all we need to do is go into publish and add a minus here, and that's going to order it in the other direction. So if I run that now, we should have the new post data 2 in the first position. So that's just a simple example there of using order by, and hopefully you can appreciate where you might want to utilize that. So at some point you will probably want to delete data from the model. So let's just go ahead and do that. So we're going to be utilizing a get here. So let's create a new variable called post. We're going to store the data inside of this variable, and then we're going to actually delete the item. So we're going to run post.objects. We're not using objects, so remember we're using new manager, and then we're going to use the .get, and we're just going to get by ID equals 1. So we're just going to return the first item in the database, and we're going to store it in this variable. I need to use posts. Okay, so that's stored. So now we're going to delete. So simply we're just going to run the post. That's where the data is, and then the delete. And there we go. So we've deleted that item from the database. So we can check that by running, use that, all, manager.all. If I do that, you can see that I can just run post now. So what I've done here, obviously I've run this query inside of this variable, so I can actually just reference the variable and it will just output the data. I guess that's an added bit of information there, so I can now just run that and see that now all I have is new data 2 in the table. So I've deleted the first post in my database. So at this point, I've successfully shown you how to create, update, delete data from your database. We've also utilized some filters and excluded items to kind of extend our query set a little bit more, so that you have a little bit more control of what data is being returned from a database. So for those who aren't familiar with the built-in admin GUI interface, let's close this up, open up a new terminal, sorry. Let's open up a new terminal and let's just run this project. So run server. So Django comes with a built-in manager, a GUI manager that we can access. Let's just create a new window, and we'll go in and access our project. So this is what it looks like at the moment. So what we can do is access the database via the admin. So if I type in admin here, I'm going to need an admin username and password. So to do that, let's just close that and run that. So create super user. That's going to allow us to create an initial user that we can access this database. So I'm going to admin. Okay, so I've added a new database. I'm going to rerun the server, and now I can go back in, and I should now be able to access the database. So by default, when we initially made our migrations, I mentioned that more database or tables were being created. So we've got groups and users here. So the user table has the admin user that I've just built, and there's probably not going to be too much in groups. Nope. Okay, so that's what we have at the moment. So notice that we have actually built a new table called posts. So we want to make that accessible within the admin area. So what we need to do is go into the admin file of the blog, and we've added 2 lines here, or 3 lines. So we've imported admin, and then we've gone ahead and imported the model, and then we've just basically registered this model. So to make it available in the admin. So we're just using the default admin tools to display the information, and we can edit this. So when we go into our admin area now, we have the blog posts, and then we've got some new data too. So that's the second item we added. Notice that the first item has been deleted. I can go in here and I can obviously edit this if I want to. So I'll just finish off by showing you or describing where these queries are going to be placed if you're not familiar with Django development. So here, for example, we've been practicing utilizing queries, some basic queries. So here you can actually see a query in use, and this is inside of a view. So what we're doing here in this method function is that we're collecting all the data from a database, and then eventually we're going to return it to a template. And inside of that template, we're going to loop through the data and show it on the screen. So this is essentially where your queries might be placed and why we've been practicing running queries. Because like I said at the start, a lot of it is behind the scenes. If we don't utilize the shell initially to run some queries and test the data that's being returned, here in the view, we simply just run the query and we assume that the data that's being returned is the data that we want, which isn't necessarily always the case. So the shell can act as a good way of debugging some of our queries that we run to check to see what data is actually being returned. So this is where it's going to be placed essentially, and then returned to the template. Okay, so that is the end of this tutorial. We covered quite a lot here in this tutorial. If you remember, we went through introduction to SQLite. There wasn't really too much there, but it is just a simple lightweight database that we utilize for testing or prototyping our projects before we then move on to Oracles and Postgres databases and so on. So I took you through what was a sweet introduction to the Python shell and the Django shell, So hopefully you've grasped what that is and how we can utilize that. We built our first model. We accessed the database from the shell. We changed the model manager. We've added data to the table. We viewed all the data from the table, retrieved single objects, and we've utilized different filters, exclude, and order by to return data. We didn't include update data. I'll do that in the next tutorial, but we did delete data, and we've also gone through the process of adding a new super user and accessing the admin, the Django GUI admin, so that you can also access your data and change it and add data and so on.